her. And thank you again, Ida, for being with us tonight.
Thank you so much. So what I'll do is I'm gonna just I have two slides from the last presentation just to recap. Um, very, very basic slides, and then I'll go into the main part of this presentation. So let me share my screen. And we'll go from there. All right, I hope everyone can see my screen. All right, let me see this. Okay. So I'm here to talk to you a little bit about Islam and Muslims and focus really on anti-Muslim bigotry. And some people call it Islamophobia. There are lots of different ways of, sort of descriptors. But I think anti-Muslim bigotry actually sums up how I feel about it in terms of what's happening. So first of all, this is from last presentation. I talked about Islam, what it meant, that it's a concept. The Arabic word Islam simply means submission to the will of God so that one can attain peace. And that's where, its root is salam, which is peace. And so that's where the peace comes in. And then I kind of link that to the word Muslim, a person who does the Islam. It's right there. This is someone who follows the way of Islam. That is someone who submits to the will of God so that one can live in peace. And the reason I was going on and on about that was because a lot of times people use these words maybe in the wrong way. They'll say the Islamic person or the Islamic patient when they, in hospitals, when they actually mean the Muslim patient. So when you're talking about people, you say Muslim. When you're talking about the religion or architecture or, sort of those kinds of things, you'd use the word Islamic. Okay, so that's where the Islam comes in. So I thought I would start with one of my least favorite slides. There was a study done before 9/11, and the study was to look at public perceptions of Muslims. And it was a study that was done nationwide, as I said again, before 9/11. And the question that they asked everybody, first of all, was, do you know a Muslim personally? And if the answer was yes, that they did know someone, they were not included in the study because this was looking at perception, right? So if the answer was actually no, I don't know a Muslim personally, the next question was, what comes to mind when you hear the word Islam or Muslim? And so this horrible list was compiled as a result of that. The perception for people who have never met a Muslim before, the perception is that Muslims are terrorists, they're violent, they're fanatical. Women are oppressed, they're submissive, they're uneducated, they cannot work. That Muslims are foreign, that they don't speak English. I hope I disprove that one. They're not our friends, they're undemocratic, they're intolerant, and they're backward. Horrible list. And I'm just wondering, I just want you guys to, if you could just write in the chat. I would really appreciate it. If people don't know these people, where do you think they get these perceptions from? And I would just like you to kind of write in the chat where you think that is. And I'm going to try and look at what you say. So, any ideas? Ah, yes. A lot of you wrote the media, and you are absolutely right. Okay, so this is great. Okay. So I finally was able to see I'll just close that now. Okay. So yes, you're absolutely right. It is number one, the media. And of course, there's, Hollywood, cultural practices of some Muslims, Islamophobia network, and I'll talk about each of these separately. But let's, before we talk about the media, I thought I would talk about this particular, it's basically, it's called The Song of Roland. And it's a really amazing poem, first written in French, in 1099 Common Era, very early on, not very recently. It was first written in French and then translated again into English. And the reason I know about it is because my daughter was doing English literature at the time, a few years ago, and this was in her textbook. And so it said, you have to read the, full Song of Roland, answer questions. And, usually in a textbook, they'll have like an introductory section and the full. So we read through the poem, and it was about this really good guy called Roland. And he was killed by Muslims. And it's very, there's a lot of description. It's really, really a sad story. And, he's such a great guy, and these Muslims are really horrible. And I felt, like, oh, this is really sad. And then I went to the introductory paragraph about this poem. And it actually said that Roland he was not killed by Muslims, but he was killed by the Basques in that region. And the reason why this was written was really it was just before a crusade, and it was to rally the troops. So maybe this is possibly the first, I don't know if it's the first, but it's an early example of spin. Um, and since that time, and before maybe, but since that time at least, we've had a lot of spin where there has been conflict, right? And so this is the first example, I think, that I know about, and it's really interesting to think about that. If you think about the media and think about the newspapers and what's on the news, um, I'll give you an example of the media and the sources of perception. In 2002, a guy called John Muhammad was um, uh, in a car, and he was basically shooting people. And he was known as the Washington Sniper. And I remember wanting to go to DC at one point in 2002 and changing my mind because it was a really scary time to be in DC. I don't know if you remember that time. You guys are probably too young to remember that. But I remember not changing my mind about going to Washington, DC. And I remember when he was caught, when he was captured, everyone was like, oh, thank God, we can finally go to DC. Um, but in the newspaper, um, it talked about him and how he, what he had done and the many people he had killed. But it also talked about his religion. What religion was he? And for me reading this, I thought, okay, he's Muslim, but what has that got to do with what he did? A few years later, in 2006, or maybe four or six, he was sentenced. He was actually sentenced to death, and since then, that death sentence has been carried out. But what was really interesting, it said the headline was John Muhammad, recent convert to Islam, all the horrible things he had done. And in that same newspaper, a few pages, along, there was another Muhammad who had just won the Nobel Peace Prize, and nothing about his faith was written in there. And you sort of wonder, why is there a difference? Sort of why, this guy's on a bad thing, his faith is mentioned. This guy's on a good thing, his faith isn't mentioned. What is the rationale behind that? And so it really, for me, it did trouble me quite a bit in terms of this story and in terms of how people read it and how people say, okay, so you see the word shooting, you see the word Muslim, you see the word violence, you see the word Muslim. And it kind of conjures, obviously a negative, the negative stereotype, which, sort of has led to these terrible perceptions, right? And then more recently, a couple of days ago, but there was a huge thing about the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. Basically, I just want to show you the headlines. It said the Wall Street Journal's opinion piece said, "Welcome to Dearborn, comma, America's jihad capital." Okay. And it was, I mean, just the titles themselves. If you think about it, it's like all these people in, sort of the word jihad, stands out in big ways. And then this other one on Saturday, the New York Times published a piece by Thomas Friedman, who's a longtime, columnist for the New York Times. And his article was entitled "Understanding the Middle East Through the Animal Kingdom." And it's really troubling. I mean, this is like a couple of days ago. So it's exceedingly troubling to me to see how these pieces and how they choose ways to inflame sort of people's feelings and sort of cause hatred, fear and hatred and et cetera, et cetera. So it's just, I mean, this is just 2 days ago. So from 1099 to 2 days ago, we've been having a lot of negative press for sure. There was a poll done in 2015 where people were asked, would they support the bombing of Agrabah? Now, I just want to I'll check my chat again. Does anyone know where Agrabah is? What country is Agrabah in? And I would like you to just put that in the okay. So Billa said no, he doesn't know where Agrabah. Anyone know where Agrabah is? Just type the country in, and we'll go on from there. Okay, everyone's saying no. Well, I'll just close this. Well, Agrabah is actually not a real city. It's a fictional city from Disney's Aladdin. And the survey found that people actually considered bombing this fictional place. Um, and what's really, and this is what it looks like. It's, I mean, who would want to bomb that? But anyway, it says, and this was the headline on that that week. It says new poll shows Americans are open to bombing pretty much any place with an Arabic sounding name. Oh, so for me, I mean, my children have Arabic sounding names. My last name is Arabic sounding. It is a concern, and I know that for kids in school, many kids in school, when they go, they'll, if their name is Muhammad, they change it to Mo. If it's Bilal, they change it to Bill. If it's Ali, they change it to Al, because they want to fit in and because there is this negativity towards an Arabic sounding anything. And so it's really, sort of sad and really quite troubling, to tell you the truth. But it's just the reality in where we live. But I have to say that since people are much more willing to talk about and listen up, to people like me, or, sort of Muslims, and have people have reached out to the Muslim community, um, um, the numbers, sort of people are much more understanding and willing to support people who are being bullied in schools, etc. And so that's a good thing. Hollywood is another source of perceptions, as we saw with the Aladdin, and in particular with Aladdin. I mean, it's a really great movie. It's got a lot of color. Robin Williams is the genie. It's interesting to note that, when there was an article about Aladdin and how they based his character and his face, and they actually based it off. There's articles saying that they based it off Tom Cruise's face, which is interesting. You wonder, I mean, Aladdin, when you watch the movie, Aladdin could be from Connecticut. The way he speaks, his mannerisms, he could be a Connecticut child. And it's really interesting. I mean, and then you look at Jafar, who is the evil, sort of protagonist, and he's like very, I mean, I don't recognize him. He's not from New England at all, and so he's from over there. There was a really interesting article about how when the film Aladdin was in theaters, it started with the song Arabian Nights, and there was actually a lyric where it said, "Where they cut off your ear." This is talking about Arabia, right? "Where they cut off your ear, if they don't like your face, it's barbaric, but hey, it's home." That was the original words to the song, and if and the anti the Arab Defamation League were very upset about that, and they spoke to the Disney Corporation, and Disney did alter the words, and now it says, if you were to look at it, if you get a DVD of the movie, it says, "Where it's flat and immense and the heat is intense, it's barbaric, but hey, it's home." It says it's now not focused on the people, it's focused now on the weather. And so it's a little, it's a very different view, and that's one of the issues that, I mean, these are movies that my children are watching, and I mean, it's all sort of under the radar for them. They don't, but for me, I'm thinking, oh my gosh, what are we telling our kids? That these people, from faraway lands, Arabia, are so barbaric, so this is something to think about when we're watching films. Really think carefully about what are we watching and why are we watching this? There's a really interesting book by Anna Film as well, by Jack Shaheen, where he reviews over 100 Hollywood movies, and he finds that Arabs and Muslims continue to be portrayed as terrorists, killers, and other villainous characters. It's amazing. I remember when I was growing up. Now you'll know how old I am. But when I was growing up, the bad guy was always Russian, and before that, the bad guy was African American, and before that, the bad guy was Native American. And it's a shame that we have to choose a group to love to hate, unfortunately. And it's true. I mean, a lot of films, will have. I have a friend whose best friend is an actor, and he cannot get a job. He's Arab. He can't get a job unless he's, sort of put in, terrorist one, terrorist two, terrorist, sort of those kinds of um, things to play. I mean, it's quite shocking, actually. And if you think about films like, when I was growing up again, films like Back to the Future with Michael J. Fox, right? That's a great movie. But how does it start? It starts with, of all people, a Libyan terrorist, right? An Arab terrorist. And they're not really speaking Arabic. If you really listen to what they're saying, they're just speaking gobbledygook kind of, they're just shouting words. that aren't really Arabic, but it's just, that's what they're trying to portray. This person, these people are enemies to us. So we've had it, I mean, since the 80s. This is way before 9/11. We've had it, 1090, sort of crusades, and it's a really interesting thing to think about. I would really, encourage you to see this clip. I mean, it's called Real Bad Arabs, and it actually shows clips of different movies, Hollywood movies, where the bad guy is Arab or Muslim or both. So it's really a interesting thing to view. So that's my Hollywood bit. All right. So the next thing is cultural practices of some Muslims. There are some things that Muslims do that isn't because of the religion, but it may be in spite of the religion, and people assume that it's a religious practice. I remember one time I was at a venue and I did my talk, and a really, really kind person came up to me and said, "I'm so happy. This is 2016. I'm so happy for you because you're driving now and you can drive." And I thought, I've been driving since, for forever. And then I realized, oh my gosh, this is, Saudi Arabia had just lifted, finally Saudi women could drive. Okay. And so this is really interesting. And I would really encourage you all, if there's something that a specific country is changing in terms of, rules, it's probably cultural and not religious. If something is doing, like, if all around the country, if all around the globe, people are doing a certain practice and they're Muslim, it may be Islamic. But generally speaking, if it's only in one country, it may be the culture of that country. Okay, so just that's a kind of a way of looking at these things. Something really, I mean, in terms of, I'll just go back to something that is really quite severe and horrible is, in terms of cultural practices, is like a practice like FGM, female genital mutilation, that happens in some areas of Africa, in some areas, it's in different countries, and it's specific to those countries. Um, I've been Muslim all my life, and sort of, I had never heard of FGM until I watched the news, and it's a very invasive process. And in these countries, there are Muslims who have this practice, there are Christians who have this practice, and there are tribal people who have this practice. It's a cultural practice as opposed to a religious practice. And so that's something that we should, sort of understand, because we're more likely to have, because we have these perceptions and we don't know people from the faith, maybe it's so easy to just assign, okay, this is what they do, when it's just a cultural practice. Okay. So the next one is Islamophobia network. This is really interesting. I mean, there's been a number of articles. This article was actually early on in 2011. Um, and this is what it looks like. You can actually access it online. And it basically looks at the different groups that spread negativity about Islam, not just negativity, but misinformation about Islam and Muslims. And it looks at where they're getting their funding from, which is really interesting. It's a small number of people, but they, have a lot of dollars in order to do this. And so it's a really interesting read. I would encourage you all to kind of look at this document. There have been, more recent documents, sort of talking about more recent issues. But this is a really well done, well thought out, well written document. And within the document, it talks about who funds it, as I said before. And then it has a group of misinformation experts. And this is like 2011. So obviously, I think the money may have gone up since that time. But it lists people like Stephen Emerson. Stephen Emerson is known for talking about I'm trying to think about, gosh, I can't remember the place. So basically he said, so Timothy McVeigh was the person who perpetrated the crime. Oklahoma City, I can't remember, I guess. So Oklahoma City bombing. And it was Stephen Emerson who said that they saw, this is typical of an Islamic terrorist group, and they saw two Arab men running away from the scene. Okay. And so he spread a lot of fear and hatred, and Muslims were not involved in that. And there are sort of several people like this who will spread information. So these are the misinformation experts. Stephen Emerson also is known for calling Birmingham in England I think a jihad state or an Islamic area that there are no Muslims in there. And the Prime Minister of England at the time, really was upset that he had said this because it was completely untrue, and he actually called him up on that, and Stephen Emerson had to apologize. Um, it's quite they have quite a lot of press, unfortunately, and this is something that we need to be aware of. And then in terms of the media, and there are some grassroots organizations also that have this echo chamber of spreading this negativity about Islam. Um, One person that I just would like to mention is it says Bridget Gabriel from ACT. She's really an interesting person who is a terrorism expert. I say this with speech marks. Um, and she was the one. I remember one time I was at a gym and I was on a treadmill. And you know how there's the screens, while you're on, the treadmill, there are screens in front of you. So there happened to be two screens, one screen showing Fox News, and it was in the Rose Garden, and I think it was in 2008 or around that time. And Barack Obama was the president at that time, and he was, giving a speech in the Rose Garden, and he introduced the next speaker. And the next speaker came up to the podium and started his speech by saying Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, which basically means in the name of the one God, the most gracious, the most merciful. When we begin our food, our meals, eating, it's a form of grace. It's mentioning God's name before we eat, and so it's a common practice to before we start anything to say Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. And so sort of I thought nothing of it, but Bridget Gabriel, the terrorism expert, said this is the war cry of the Muslims. They have taken over the Rose Garden. So I was in the gym thinking, oh my gosh, what are these people watching? And I'm thinking, I'm kind of cowering, thinking, I hope nobody heard what she said. Because it's like it was, sort of completely complete misinformation. Um, her organization is called Act for America. We've had some, sort of run-ins with Act for America in Connecticut. There was a time when I was invited to a church where they had a series. And the first thing in the series, just like this one, the first presentation in the series was on general Islam, foundational Islam. And one of my friends gave an excellent talk. But when they were doing the series, they also said that, okay, so there were three talks, okay? My friend was doing the general Islam. I was doing, I think, women in Islam. And the next week, and the next week, my husband was going to talk about hot button issues. And he was going to talk about Sharia and jihad and various topics like that. And so they put a press release out about the gathering. And the pastor of the church called us, and he said, there are these really strange calls about this these presentations. They want to know the format of the presentation. They want to know how many people, if they're allowed to ask questions. And I'm I've never had this before. People have never called me up a week before to ask me these things. And so I thought, okay, this sounds a little sort of interesting. And so I decided to go to the first talk. And I went to the first talk, and it was great. Everyone was very welcoming. It was a great talk, and it was well received. And then the next week I gave my talk on women in Islam. And again, it was people were very kind, it was very well received, everything was fine. The next week, my husband stood up, and his presentation was hot button issues. And when we entered the room, the pastor came up to me and he said, there are a few people in this room who I do not know, and they have put themselves in different areas of the room. And I thought, oh, this is really interesting. And so my husband got up and he said, let's recap. And he spoke about a few things, and then he was about to start talking about the hot button issues that he was supposed to talk about, when a woman got up and said, really in an angry tone, you guys think, own your women. You don't let them speak. And this is, sort of unacceptable. And she went on. There was this huge diatribe that she was aiming at my husband. Um, and what was really interesting is the person next to her who had been there the week before said, well, actually his wife did speak yes last week about women in Islam. And so that, sort of people began to realize that this was an organized group that were just coming to disrupt. And that was maybe my first experience of, these kinds of disruptions from people in, these organizations that, have this aim to misinform people about Islam and Muslims. So that's just an example of that. And there are, there are several different examples as well that I could add to it. In terms of, the media, I remember there was just after 9/11, I remember Mike Savage said, there was a quote from him saying that we should nuke Mecca, as, and a lot of people were, very supportive of that idea because there's so much negativity and so much misinformation, I would say. All right, and in 2012 they had this anti-Muslim poster kind of thing happening in the New York City subways. It says here, in any war between, and this is like 2012, right? It says, in any war between the civilized man and the savage, support the civilized man, support Israel, defeat jihad. Basically saying, sort of linking jihad with the savage, who's, and they're kind of putting in their own idea of what all those things are, right? And it's kind of talking about jihad in a very negative context. And I have to say, for me as a Muslim, when I think of the word jihad, I don't think of it in a negative context. I mean, we think about jihad as an inner struggle. And as a result of those other ads, Muslims got together and they decided to also have an ad campaign of their own, where they would talk about what jihad meant to them. And so this is one. It says, my jihad is to build friendships across the aisle. What's yours? Okay. And this one, this is like a little heartbreaking because, this is a mother who's lost her youngest child. And she says, my jihad is to march on despite losing my son, right? Now, many of you, when you hear the word jihad, you automatically assume that it is holy war. And as a Muslim, I know, as a Muslim and, in my faith, that there's nothing holy about war. Um, and so I just wanted to re-emphasize that fact. Um, Jihad can be used to defend yourself. Um, and, but the greater jihad is that of your own internal struggle with your own soul. And so that's when I talk about jihad, it's like instilling in my children a love of God. When I talk, that's a struggle. It can be a struggle, um, and that's how I use that term. Of course, in the mainstream news, it's used in a very negative way, and sort of the people who are horrible people are called jihadists, and it's linked to this horrible this sort of terrorism and negativity. But for me, a jihad is an inner struggle. So I just wanted people to understand that there is definitely a difference in how we understand these terms. Okay, so another source of perception, I mean, I did mention a few hate groups, but one that I thought I would also mention is the KKK. This is an ad from the KKK in 2015. It says, the KKK wants you, help us fight the spread of Islam in our country. To join, call the hotline or visit our website. They have a website, they have a hotline. I mean, this is very, very worrying, I have to say. As a mother, as someone who is Muslim, it is very worrying. A few years ago, they had a campaign in England in April that said, they said it was April 3rd, and they said, this is the Punish a Muslim Day. And I remember looking at that, and one of my good friends whose daughter wears the hijab, she was very worried. And, her daughter goes, running, every morning. And she said, please don't go out today because this is they've got this campaign to punish a Muslim, and there's there's this whole kind of list of what you will, what sort of things you can do to Muslims, and it was horrible. Um, and I should have put a slide about that up, but you can look it up. And it's just a horrible idea. The issue for us is that 62% of Americans have never met a Muslim, which means that 62% of us have those, perceptions of fear and that Muslims are terrorists, that they're violent, they, will oppress women, etc., etc. They're foreign, they don't speak English, all those things that we saw earlier. And so this is a huge concern for the Muslim community living here in America. It's really interesting to note that if you think about Muslims in America, we're around 3.45 million in the nation, very diverse. A third of us are African American, a third of us roughly are South Asian immigrants, and a third of us are others, meaning Arabs, Africans, Southeast Asians, Europeans, and others. We're just 1.1% of the population. And yet, I think I mentioned this last time, and yet, although we're just 1.1% of the population, we are around 5% of the physicians working in North America. And so it's interesting how we are known for these negative, violent things as opposed to healing. Because the numbers tell me that there are a disproportionately large number of physicians who are Muslim in the United States of America, healing our nation. And it should be, this is something that we should be aware of. So I just wanted to show you a few references. And I thought I would talk a little bit about a few stories, but what I wanted to do is I wanted to end this part and then go to the main to see all of you because I can't see you with this screen. So I just thought I would end with some references and then we'll have the discussion. And I had a story to tell you, but this is a great reference. It's called The Muslim Next Door, the Quran, the media, and that veil thing. I like the title. And it kind of there are many really good well-written books. This book is kind of easy to read, and it describes this Sumbul Ali Karamali's journey as being an American Muslim, and it's written by a woman. So that's the other thing that I really love about it. The other very useful reference is written by Dalia Mogahed. It's not very clear there, but it's called Who Speaks for Islam? What a Billion Muslims Really Think. And it's just a really good kind of a study of, sort of different populations. It actually conveys the fact that there are so many different Muslims around, the nation, the world, and how, we shouldn't just put everybody into one box. We're not monolithic. I think that was one of the take homes from last time, that we're not monolithic. Okay. And then of course there's I mentioned this, my husband's book about Stigmatized from 9/11 to Trump and Beyond. And he does talk about his own experiences. And he also has a section that explains Islam, Sharia, and Jihad as well. So those kinds of things are sort of it's a useful reference. And then of course this document, which is called Fear Inc., which I mentioned before, is a really great reference for people who want to know about the different the roots in terms of the Islamophobia network and where they get their funding from, et cetera, et cetera. So it's really a, sort of an important study that they did.